Hi, I'm Ashley Cooley, a birth, baby, and sleep specialist and mom of 3. There's so much information out there, right? This show is dedicated to helping you clear out the noise so you can figure out what will work best for your baby and your family. If you're looking to learn more about your baby, gain more confidence in your parenting, and get as much sleep as you can through it all, you've come to the right place. Bringing up baby is about to get a little easier. Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Ashley Cooley. I'm the owner of Birth Baby Sleep, and this episode is about perimenopause. You guys, I know what you're thinking. Ashley, what are you doing talking about perimenopause? This is a podcast that we go to for information about our babies, to try to get better sleep, to maybe be more confident, well-rested, happier parents. Why are we talking about perimenopause? Well, I know most of you are women, and if you're not a woman listening to this, you have women in your life. And we should all be very much more aware about perimenopause, menopause, what is coming down the pike. Some of you might be in perimenopause already. Welcome to the club. Others are not there yet, and maybe you won't be that soon, but trust me, it's coming. And this is a conversation that is going to introduce you to the topic. I'm going to introduce you to someone really cool in this space and has a lot of great information and knowledge and resources. And she and I are going to chat about all of this and what's to come. So I can't wait for you to listen. Consider this your introduction to perimenopause. We'll put a pin in this and we'll get back to the baby and parenting content next time. But please give this a listen. Save this. It's going to be really eye-opening. All right. And without further ado, here is my conversation with our special guest, Jen Salib Huber, to talk about perimenopause. Hello, Jen. Nice to see you again. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Ashley. Thanks so much for having me.
Before we dive into all the good stuff, I would love for you to start us off and to share a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. So my name is Jen Salib Huber. I'm originally from Dartmouth, and I'm a naturopathic doctor and a dietitian, and I was in Dartmouth for the better part of really 20 years until a few years ago. My family kind of embarked on an adventure that is lasting a little longer than intended, but we're living in the Netherlands now for a couple more years. But I primarily work with people who are in some stage of midlife, not defined by an age necessarily, but more kind of the reproductive stage that they're in, which typically is people who are in their late 30s, but can be as early as 35 through their 40s and beyond. And just trying to help them manage menopause with food and nutrition, but really staying out of the diet mentality, so that they can kind of emerge with a healthier relationship with food in their body.
That's one of the reasons why I love you. The undiet mentality, which I so appreciate and love. And it's in all of your, and we're going to get to where to find you on Instagram and your podcast and all that stuff, because you put that stuff out there really well. But, we probably already have some listeners thinking, Ashley, who is this person? We're talking to 35 plus year old people. Some of us may still be in our 20s or early 30s, but you know what? Most of our listeners are women. And this is a conversation that if we can at least introduce you to it, it's very important to have. So Jen and I are going to be talking about perimenopause, which actually I have to say, and I'm sure you're aware of this as well, we are having kids later in life. Sometimes we are over 35 and the quote unquote geriatric pregnancies, or early 40s having babies. And so this topic could be extremely relevant to those people right now.
Absolutely.
But if not, it's something that's coming. This is an event that is approaching that we should be talking more about. So can you break it down for us, Jen? What is menopause and what is perimenopause?
And just to kind of tack on to what you were saying, it is so important that we start talking about this, because one of the things that I realized, so I'm going to be 47 next year, and I went into perimenopause at 37. And so I went into menopause just 2 months before my 45th birthday. So it was really clear that I was on the earlier side of average for the journey. And I didn't realize it, even though this was my job. I didn't realize that I was in perimenopause because I wasn't expecting it at 37. And we know that about 20% of people will meet the criteria for perimenopause before they're 40. So some of your listeners absolutely will be in that. This doesn't apply to me, but it might. Or you might have older friends, mothers, sisters, aunts who might be going through it. And we don't teach people about the changes in perimenopause like we do puberty and pregnancy.
Mm.
And there's been so much, there's been a lot of surveys that have asked, trying to figure out how many people are prepared and how many people know about it. And it's often 50%, 40 to 50% of people are surprised that they're in perimenopause or don't feel like they don't know when it's happening.
Mm.
And I mean, you work with people who are having babies. Can you imagine if 50% of people were surprised that they were pregnant? Can you imagine? We would call that a massive public health failure.
Right. And even
Or
what you were saying about how we prepare for pregnancy and puberty, and of course, I try to help prepare people for pregnancy, and that's part of my job. But like, we could even be doing a lot of that stuff better, especially the puberty part.
absolutely,
So this is all part of the conversation because it is that
yes,
reproductive health. But anyway,
exactly.
continue.
So, perimenopause is the period of time leading up to your last menstrual period. So, menopause is actually only a single day. It is the day that marks 12 months since your last period. Everything after that is postmenopause, and everything before that is perimenopause. And obviously, we don't know you're there until it's been 12 months. So,
Mm,
when you
mm.
hear someone say, I'm in menopause, it's probably, they're just referencing kind of that stage of life where they might be having fewer periods or no periods. But really, we're talking about perimenopause and postmenopause. So, perimenopause can happen naturally, it can happen as early as 35. The average is much more likely, much closer to 45, but it sometimes doesn't happen until our 50s because there's a huge range of when women go through that menopausal transition. The average age of menopause is 51. That means that you're going to have some people at 41 and some people at 61.
Mm.
So, what we want to try and think about is, okay, well, what's happening reproductively that defines it? Because we don't have a test. You can't pee on a stick. Well, actually, now you can, but there's a lot of debate as to whether or not there's any value in that or any accuracy. So don't be peeing on sticks to find out about perimenopause.
Okay.
But it is still technically a clinical diagnosis, meaning that we want to look at your age, we want to look at your family history. So the age that your mother, older sister, aunt went into menopause, and what are your symptoms. So it is generally guided by symptoms. And the thing that happens more often, though, is that there's this bit of crossover between what's called the late reproductive stage, which is kind of your less fertile years, but still
Sure.
fertile,
Yeah.
still having a regular period, not meeting the clinical diagnostic criteria for perimenopause, but probably starting to have whispers of it. So you might be starting to notice that your sleep is changing the week before your period. You might be starting to notice that your energy levels are changing or that you're having more headaches. So, one of the big things for me was that at 37, I had 3 kids under the age of 7. I was very busy in life, and all of my symptoms, which were related to sleep and mood and energy, were kind of just being chalked up to life. It's like, oh, well,
Mm,
you're so busy. Of
mm.
course, you're not sleeping well. Of course, you have all these things. And that's often what happens is that so many people fall through the cracks in these late reproductive stages until something starts to change with their period. So, when someone's cycle starts to change by more than 7 days, so it's either 7 days shorter or 7 days later, but they're not skipping them yet, they're just kind of changing by 7 days or more. That is usually kind of the first real outward sign of early perimenopause.
Okay.
In this stage, you're still having regular periods, but they're probably changing not just in length. You might spot more. They might be heavier some months, lighter some months. You might have more pain or cramping with them. You're probably noticing that PMS is getting worse. So that is definitely one of the first things that people will say to me is, oh my goodness, my 2 days of PMS is now like 2 weeks. What is going on?
Mm, mm.
It's all part of that perimenopausal change.
Wow.
And then once you start skipping periods, so once you have gone more than 60 days a couple of times, you are in late perimenopause. And I kind of describe it as you're scraping the bottom of the barrel. So you're going to start going long periods of time
Yeah.
without having an ovulatory cycle. And you may even have some anovulatory cycles. So where your body just kind of says, we're going to press reset and you're going to have a period, but it's not going to feel like a normal period. And it's going to try and start over again. That can happen for 1 to 3 years. And so we know that the later perimenopausal stage is more kind of defined in that 1 to 3 years after you start skipping periods, you're probably going to have your last period. And then everything after that is postmenopause.
Well, hot dang. Like I mean, you and I have had these conversations. I'm 39, so I am getting those whispers. They are whispering,
Mhm.
sometimes loudly. So it has been really interesting to kind of merge that with, and you kind of alluded to this, like sort of the end of our reproductive years. Maybe we ourselves are done having children, and maybe we are creeping up to 35, closer between 35,
Yeah.
40, whatever, early 40s. And so I wonder, do we have to differentiate, or how can we differentiate between, maybe are we still in postpartum here, like with how it takes hormones a while to adjust to that, especially too if you're breastfeeding, or is it perimenopause? Does it even matter? Like, how can we
Well,
differentiate
and
with that?
there's no real way to know, in the sense that if you are breastfeeding, especially, and your prolactin levels are high, that's going to keep your estrogen levels lower. And so that's going to make it less likely that you're going to ovulate, especially in those first 6 months when if you're breastfeeding exclusively.
Hmm.
But even if you're not, as you know, it's very individual. Some people don't get a period for a year, and then some people are breastfeeding every 45 minutes and it comes back at 2 months. Like, it's very individual, so there's no real way to know.
Yeah.
What I have found is that for people who may be having a baby in their late 30s, early 40s, is that when they stop breastfeeding and their cycle comes back, it feels a little different. So they'll say, like, "Ah, it came
Mm,
back and it's really, now it's every 25 days. It always used to be to every 28 days." That could be a sign that you're moving closer to that later reproductive, early perimenopause stage. But there absolutely is a lot of overlap for a lot of people.
mm,
And this is where it can get a little bit muddy, and there really isn't any way to know. Knowing what is normal for you can be helpful,
yeah,
but it often changes after a baby anyway, right? So what
absolutely.
was normal before a baby is going to not be the same for most people. But I encourage people to track their cycle. When I had 11 years of data, and I've shared this before in different places, but it was so neat. I tracked every period I had from my first postpartum period in January of 2011 until my last menstrual period, which would
Mm,
have been like just over 2 years ago now. And to see the patterns of, like, normal, shorter, longer, done. It was really, really neat.
wow.
And so if you track even just day one to day one, you don't have to track anything else. But if you just track how long that period of time is from one cycle to the next, you will probably be able to pick up on some of these changes, just by kind of looking at your own data.
Mm, mm. I found I've been way more in tune with my body and my cycle, particularly in the last year, I would say, because I've been paying attention. I think I really needed a while in my life to not pay attention, because for anybody trying to conceive or has gone through the many months or
Absolutely.
years to have a baby, you've probably been tracking this stuff a lot and maybe you're sick of it. So I can
Yeah.
understand how that might be a challenge. But I did find it quite interesting when I started paying more attention, because I started to notice some changes. And I probably had an appointment or two with you at the time. And I was like, oh, okay, so I want to be more aware of this so that when there are changes coming up, I can really say what's going on, or I have a more clear picture of that.
Absolutely.
Um, so what are some of the myths that we're hearing about menopause and perimenopause? So I think you already dispelled one of them, that menopause is like a day, or it's
Mhm.
like, or maybe sometimes people maybe use it as an umbrella term. I find I do sometimes, where it's just like that whole, it includes peri and includes post, it's just the whole thing. But what are some myths that you hear, since you're talking to people about this all the time, about whether it's menopause or even perimenopause? Can you share
Yeah. So
some?
one of the biggest ones is that people are often told that they're too young. So perimenopause is, certainly there's an age range that I mentioned that is more common and typical, but some people go through premature menopause, and could be actually in perimenopause in their 20s. And so, we have to stop, like, using an age bracket as the defining term, because we're going to miss people. And what happens is that people will go into their healthcare provider and say, "Hey, could I be in perimenopause?" One of the first questions, again, that's a myth, is, "Well, are you skipping periods?" Well, if we're using that as our barometer, people are halfway through perimenopause. They're already in late perimenopause if we're waiting for them
Mm,
to skip period.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, early perimenopause, in my experience, is one of the more symptomatic periods because it's a lot of like, what is going on? I don't understand. I don't feel like myself. This isn't who, all of these things are changing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're having those concerns dismissed or not validated because of information that isn't true, that's not helping anyone. So certainly around the stage, and the other one is around hot flashes. So many people will be asked, well, are you having hot flashes? You do not have to be having hot flashes to be in perimenopause. So a lot of people will experience them. We know that 75% of women will go through kind of the typical vasomotor symptoms, hot flashes, night sweats, heart
Just
palpitations.
gonna say, how about those night sweats in there?
Yeah,
Oh my
exactly.
God.
Um,
Okay.
but they don't happen to everyone, and they sometimes don't happen in early perimenopause. They did for me. I had more of them in early perimenopause than I did in late. So by the time I got to late perimenopause, they had almost disappeared.
Interesting.
And lots of other people will have the opposite. Some people never get them. So we can't use a single symptom as a barometer of what's happening in perimenopause. Those are probably the big ones. The only other one I'd throw in there is that you have to have your hormones checked. So a lot of people will want their hormones checked. They'll either through blood work or urine tests or saliva tests, and they understandably think and want to see a number to say like yes or no,
Mm-hmm.
but we really can't hang our hats on any test result, because if somebody is in early perimenopause and still having regular cycles, chances are their hormones are going to be normal. They're going to be within the normal cycling range.
Mm-hmm.
When somebody is in late perimenopause, we would expect to see some hormone changes there because you're now skipping periods. We would expect to see that in your blood work more often than not. But even then, because it's not predictable and reliable, if we just happen to measure on the right day, everything could still look normal.
Totally.
So you don't need a blood test for diagnosis. You don't need a blood test for treatment. So if you're having symptoms and you think, well, I have to wait to get some blood work before my doctor can treat me, that is also not true. We don't need any blood work for hormone levels. There may be blood work for other reasons that needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, a lot of it is just recognizing that it's a clinical picture, meaning that we need to take your symptoms, we need to take your age, we need to take your family history into account and use that as our guide.
Mm. Let's talk about that treatment part for a second, because I did a little um preemptive. Well, no, it was for myself. I wanted to talk. I like talking to you. I like talking to naturopaths and other alternative health avenues, because I find that you really get to spend the time with your patients or your clients, and you get to really talk about these things. When I asked my doctor, whom I appreciate and uh, admire, and she's wonderful. She's a wonderful doctor, as are probably lots of other doctors out there. But my friends, myself, when we go to our doctors with some of these symptoms, the answer is the birth control pill, or some
Mm-hmm.
version of that. And so I can appreciate how that would help regulate things probably more quicker than not. Um, what's your take on that, or what is your approach to the I'll use that term treatment loosely, or just managing symptoms, or how can we help what is inevitable? We're not all going to experience the same things, but we're going to experience something more than likely. So what can we do about it?
So, and it's very, very common for the birth control pill to be offered, especially for a lot of the symptoms related to like heavy periods and painful periods. And it's not that it's wrong, because for many people, it's incredibly effective at managing that. Where the kind of counter argument comes in is that if we want to provide the most evidence based effective treatment for the hormone changes and symptoms related to perimenopause, using menopausal hormone replacement therapy, or HRT as some people might know it, is actually the more effective, better, safer option. It's lower dose than the pill. So
Mm,
using hormonal HRT is a much lower dose. It tends to be different types of hormones, and they tend to be the ones that are more similar to what our body makes and produces. At least there are more options available for that, which tends to have fewer side effects and fewer risks. The oral birth control pill, for example, one of the risks with it is blood clots. And so we need to be aware of that in people who are over 40
Mhm.
versus using some of the transdermal forms of estrogen, either the patch or the gels and the creams, essentially eliminates the risk associated with blood clots. So I think a lot of people are more familiar with it, including prescribers. So family doctors may just feel like they're more familiar with the pill. It's what they know. They've prescribed it every day for 40 years. And that's where maybe having a resource, finding somebody who is kind of a menopause specialist who might be able to walk you through the different options, maybe working with your doctor, maybe referring you to somebody else. But it's not that there's anything wrong with it. It's just that as a long-term option, I
Mhm.
don't think that it's in line with the best evidence.
That makes sense. And in all fairness, I was speaking to her primarily around kind of menstrual cycle type stuff.
Yeah.
And she was pretty clear, or just thinking that, like, yeah, you're still quite young for perimenopause. So this sounds like it would be the better option. So I guess that's where, and maybe she's right, but maybe not. And so I like the combination of, that's how I like to work, is like, I'm going to run things by and ask my doctor and get that support. But maybe there's other people, other places, other things that have a bit more of that.
Yeah.
Um, not that, yeah, more knowledge on that particular topic. And that can be helpful.
So, and it's interesting about the periods too. One of the ways that I describe the one of the period changes that's very common, these heavy periods that I started calling my crime scene periods
Mm.
because they had gotten so heavy
Hmm.
and that I really couldn't leave the house, and I had to set alarms through the night and had to like sleep with like all the like the padding and the towels, and it was like, okay, this is craziness. And when
Hmm.
I mention that to other people, or when other people hear me describe that, they'll say, oh yeah, that happened to me too. I didn't realize that was part of it. And so that sometimes shows up before your cycle changes in length. So this is one of those really common overlaps between postpartum and early
Mm.
perimenopause. Um, where your estrogen levels can sometimes run higher than they did before because of the way that perimenopause works. You may have some months where that lining builds up very quickly, very heavily, and shedding it is not a fun time.
Mm.
So, recognizing that there are some symptoms that I think need to be looked into, need to be managed. Like, I don't think anybody should have to just like suffer that out.
Hmm.
And sometimes the pill is actually going to be the fastest way to get somebody out of that crime scene period. If you're having that crime scene period every 20 days, and it's
That's a
lasting
lot.
for 10 days,
Yeah.
you by the time that you get referred to somebody and they start looking at other things, it could be months down the road.
Mm.
And so it might be a completely, valid treatment choice to offer that, that birth control pill for a few months just to kind of get things calmed down, or to
Mm.
let your iron catch up. That's the other thing, is that
Ooh.
if you're having those really heavy periods, your iron is going to be struggling. And
Yeah.
so anything that we can do to just like calm that down is going to help you feel better.
Okay. This is good to know. So it's like there's options out there, and you brought up the hormone replacement therapy, and even that there's creams and gels, and like there's other things, and maybe we don't need to necessarily go there right now for a lot of our
Yeah.
listeners. Um but that's all really helpful, and like the side effects, very interesting stuff. What about in terms of food? Because I know for
Yeah.
yourself, as part of that nutritionist stuff, you really like to bring food to the table, no pun intended, of like, wait, how this can actually help our hormones. So can you speak to that a little bit?
So, and the conversation around food has gotten a little bit complicated because you have all these people who are selling and promoting like these hormone balancing diets. So, my first disclaimer is always that like we can't balance your hormones with food, but we can contribute to your overall health, which will have an impact on your hormones. So, the kind of exception to that would be around some of the foods that contain phytoestrogen. So, phytoestrogenic foods would be things like soy, flax, chickpeas, some others, but those would be kind of the big ones. And these contain these plant-based compounds that have the ability to bind to our some of our estrogen receptors and have a very, very mild estrogenic effect. This can be really helpful, especially if you're in perimenopause and having symptoms, but it doesn't work for everyone. We don't exactly understand why, but we do know that for some people, and I was one of them, that was a big part of my journey, was that I tried hormone replacement therapy and it did not work for me. Well, it worked, but I couldn't handle the side effects. And so that was kind of my journey to figuring out what else I could do, and really including those phytoestrogenic foods regularly was a big part of how I got through the hot flashes until the end. So, there are things that we can do on the phytoestrogen side that might help to alleviate some of the symptoms. But some of the other kind of key priorities are really related to, we know you're going through this stage, and I call it hormone soup. So your hormone soup is changing.
Mm.
You've made this one kind of soup for most of your reproductive life, and now your soup's going to change, and it's going to change forever. And it's going to mean that the ingredients are changing, and every cell in your body has receptors for estrogen. And most have receptors for progesterone. And so we need to kind of prepare for the effects of that. And the effects are primarily what's going to happen to your heart, what's going to happen to your bones, what's going to happen to your brain, and what's going to happen to just kind of the things that you're used to having, as part of living in the body that you have. So we want to start making some of those early deposits in perimenopause. So we want to be thinking about, okay, my protein needs, do they actually go up by how much? And should I be focusing on different kinds of protein? Should I be adding in more fiber, because fiber is the secret sauce? How can I start to think about the fact that my cholesterol is going to go up 10 to 20% in menopause simply because I've lost the estrogen? So
Mm.
how can I start adding in these habits now that are going to make it so much easier to have this like well-established habit? How can I mitigate the risk of osteoporosis? We lose, I think it's somewhere upwards of 10 to 20% of our bone density in the first few years after we stop having a period. How do we start to think about that? Because we don't want to be having a fracture in our hip at 65. So there's all of these things that, and this is part of the, like, we need the puberty talk for perimenopause, because if you're not having these conversations until after your last period, you're going to feel like you have a lot of catching up to do, and it might feel a little bit rushed and panicked. So if we can start thinking about these things now, saying like,
Mhm.
hey, you're 45, regardless of where you're at, let's have a chat about, like, where are you at with these things? How are you feeling? Let's start putting some of them into practice now. And so that you'll feel like you can kind of just coast when you get there.
Yes, I love that. And that's exactly why we wanted to have you on and talk about this, because not only should we be at least having this in the back of our mind that this is going to happen and it's coming up at some point, but when you do start noticing some of those early symptoms, that you are starting to get on top of this, because like you just said, it's not just about our reproductive years. Like, these hormones have an effect on, this is why rates for heart disease goes up for women in menopause or after, the osteoporosis, those types of things. So that's really, I like to think about that, and that you're really helping your health long term by thinking of this right now. I think I read this, correct me if I'm wrong. Is it us, like human women and whales? Are we the only mammals that live beyond menopause? Is
Oh
that?
no, there's just so many more than that now. So
Oh,
we used
okay.
to think it was just whales, but there's a few different kinds of whales. They've just discovered that chimps do. I've read about giraffes. Like, there's quite a few that live beyond the time when we're able to, reproduce. And I think it's such an important thing, because if it's not just us, it means that there's value to, reproductively, evolutionarily speaking, you know, it wouldn't still be happening if there wasn't value to it. And there's some really interesting studies that have looked at this. There's some that have examined birth and death records of children, mainly in like the 1800s. There's been some done in Quebec, there's some in Finland, where they found that children who were born within like a certain kilometer radius of a grandmother were more likely to survive infancy.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that
Wow.
neat?
Yeah.
And so, clearly there's an advantage. I mean, I was so lucky that my mom was, nearby when my kids were small, and, we still call her Mary Poppins. She was hands down, she certainly made sure I survived my children's childhood.
Uh,
And probably contributed to them surviving too. But, like it was such a valuable thing that I can absolutely see that, 150 years ago, when we didn't have running water and we didn't have all those things and we had to go hunt and gather food more often than we do now, that it would have had an advantage. And so the grandmother hypothesis, which is the really cool thing that is trying to kind of explain why we are seeing this more, or it's always been there. I think we're just kind of looking for it more. Is that, we are at a place where we are wise in postmenopause. We have lived experience. We don't have I don't want to call it a burden, but just, the burden of having small, dependent children. I have teenagers now. There are days when I sometimes don't see them for a good part of the day. It's a totally weird thing. But, we have time to actually reflect on our lived experience and share it, and also want to take care of the people that we love around us.
So interesting. I think that relationship with grandparents and little ones is reciprocal. I think I've heard some
Yes.
things that
Yes.
grandparents live
They
longer
benefit too. Yeah.
so get them involved in that child rearing. It's benefiting everybody. Jennifer, this has been such an eye-opening and helpful conversation, even to me, who has been learning about this now for a little while, but I know it'll be helpful for a lot of our listeners who maybe it's been their first time or they're just getting started on this. It's nice to know that there's other places and people out there that we can go to for that support. So with that in mind, can you share your Instagram, your podcast? Where can people find you? Because there's a wealth of information over there, I know.
Oh, thanks. So I hang out on Instagram, probably too much, but I hang out at menopause.nutritionist. You can find me there. My podcast is The Midlife Feast. And this, I try and, like you, bring in conversations not just related to menopause, but also kind of the things that like circle it. So we're sometimes talking about relationship stuff, or we're talking about, creativity and how it shows up in midlife. And it's just a great place that I love to hang out. And there's also a membership community by the same name for anybody who's kind of just looking for people who are maybe in this age and stage with a little bit of support on the side.
Amazing. Well, I'll put all that in our show notes for easy to find for people. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Maybe we'll have you back for another one, but I like to, like you said, it's about having these conversations that kind of surround parenting as part of our life. It's going to be part of our life. So let's start figuring out who we can follow, what we can do now to make that a little bit smoother. So thank you again so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you're looking for more information or support along your parenting journey, check out birthbabysleep.ca. That's where you're going to find prenatal classes, postpartum and new baby resources, and sleep support during the childhood years. You can now join our Bringing Up Baby community membership as well, which has tons of additional benefits to helping you through all kinds of sleep challenges and transitions, navigating the transition to solid foods, and even your transition through early parenthood. If you have any questions, just send them my way. Lastly, but certainly not least, if you got something out of this episode or our show in general, leaving a rating or a quick review goes a really long way to helping others find us. So please consider leaving one. That's all for now. I'm Ashley Cooley, and we'll see you back here next time.